The road home. From Tahiti towards New York, the 13,000-mile sea road by way of the Horn divides itself naturally into three sections: the run to the Horn first, then from the Horn to the line, and lastly from the line to landfall. Until the first of these was behind us, we did not think of the others. The far southern headland of all the Americas was, in a sense, the climax of the long voyage, the last turning point, whereafter nothing but the Atlantic remained. To reach it, I stood first towards the south, hoping to come quickly down to the region of the wild west winds, and then to turn southeastwards and storm towards the Horn. Once south of 40, I knew we should not be long. But our setting out was slow, and in the first week the blue Pacific was so quiet that we made scarce 400 miles. I passed again through the Austral Islands, this time having Rurutu in sight throughout a hazy day. Near here was Moses Reef, one of the worst of its kind, a mid-ocean blemish, showing no sign above the surface, and not breaking in that quiet weather. I gave it a goodly berth, coming by with the full moon of the quiet Pacific night, with the ship heeled gently towards her shadowed sails on the soft foam of her own making, and aloft the three towers of the mast, all graceful, on deck the clean sweep of her shone beneath the moon, with the dew-covered teak reflecting the light upon the white houses and the boats, where all things, all lines, all gear, were ship-shape and trim and in good order. We stood on very slowly towards the south, losing longitude, for the wind was from the south of east, and I was full and by, with the yards off the backstays, getting the best speed I could. Once arrived in the stamping ground of the west winds, a little lost longitude would not matter. Day after day, now all hands worked steadily at preparing the ship for the winter's rounding of the Horn. She had several danger spots, being so low-decked, and with the 'tween decks all accommodation. Every deck opening was a danger spot, the three big skylights, largely made of glass, the doors leading to the main 'tween decks where the boys lived, the door to the quarters forward, and the port side of the deck-house, and the chart-house doors. I considered the problems of the skylights for a long time. We had run our longitude down from Good Hope towards the Lewin with them also in midwinter, but that was on 40 south, and we had now to go nearly to 60, almost to the Antarctic. The seas that rage down there are the highest and the worst in the world, and I meant to take no chances. We built up wooden breakwaters over the skylights, and then covered them with two stout tarpaulins of sail canvas, the whole lashed down securely to ring bolts on the deck, and the edges of the tarpaulin battened on the deck and made fast. One of the 'tween-deck doors was closed, caulked, and built up, and the other was fitted with a high washboard. The door to the accommodation forward was fitted with a strong canvas screen secured on a frame of steel. The chart-house doors were re-rubbered, and washboards were fitted. Deadlights were screwed down, and everything movable taken from the decks, including the guns. These were stowed in the hold. Everything remaining on deck was securely lashed, including the lifeboats. The royal yards were sent down, the flying jib unbent, the triangular storm trysail bent in place of the spanker, and the triangular storm mainsail sent to the main yard. New preventer braces were rove at fore and main. The mizzen did not matter so much, since in bad weather the square sail was taken from the mizzen mast soon enough. The pigs were shifted from the exposed sty on the fore deck to a secure dry place beneath the foresail head. The cables had been unshackled and taken inboard so that the hawse pipes could be plugged and cocked, and no water came in over the decks that way. The capstan and windlass were oiled and covered. The storm fore topsail of hurricane canvas, which Carl had sewed between Samaray and Tahiti, was bent. It was much smaller than the ordinary topsails. It was so small that it had a permanent reef in it. It was the size of the ordinary topsail single reefed. This was a great advantage in a gale. The single topsails, while splendid drawing sails and most picturesque, added considerably to the work in bad weather. With double topsails the ship would have been 3 times as handy. However, I liked her as she was, and giving her double topsails was too big a job to tackle at that late stage. All the sails we had sewed were of strong Scots hemp canvas, and we gave them bolt ropes of wire. In the Danish days they had been hemp, but the canvas on a long voyage outlasts a bolt rope if it is good canvas, bravely sewn. We had rove off 2 topgallant sheets of chain and wire instead of Danish hemp. A few minor improvements of that kind better fitted the ship for long continued hard weather sailing. After all, the Danes had been accustomed to use the ship only for 6 months of the year, and to anchor most of the nights. This was different. All the sizings on the rigging lanyards had been made good. Aloft all the mousings, sizings, and chafing mats had been renewed. The foot ropes had been overhauled. New gear was rove off wherever necessary, and the foresail and the three topsails were given completely new sets of bunt lines and leech lines of new 4-stranded manila. It is old gear that causes the loss of half the sails. I had not been unmindful of the comfort of the crew so far as that could be looked after. I had built a protection of canvas dodgers made from old hammocks on the top of the forward house to shelter the lookouts from the worst of the spray and the hail, and I did everything possible to keep the bunks and the quarters dry. The Horn is bad enough in winter without having the quarters flooded and the bunks all sodden. We had no stoves except some oil ones which were unhealthy, but I was of the opinion that a stove is a questionable benefit and can, in a crowd of boys, do more harm than good. We had no heating system, but everyone had ample clothing and good oilskins. The whole crew, fore and aft, was now Nordic, and with one exception had been born and bred in comparatively cold countries. Only the 2 Americans had been accustomed to winter heat in their homes. The New Zealanders were well used to the cold. To the Danes and the other Scandinavians, the run towards the Horn, even in July, was summery compared with winter sailing in their own Baltic. There was plenty of bedding fore and aft, and a great supply of spare woolen blankets, so many that mittens could be made from them, and caps to fit over the ears under the southwesters. I took all care I could of the comfort of all hands, much more than is customary in merchant vessels, but after all I was the guardian of most of them. I was also the physician, and I did not want to have any avoidable ills on my hands. Exposure can be a wretched enemy, and we should have enough to suffer from it anyway. The food was good and ample. Such things as milk, jam, sugar, and a few more had to be shared out on allowance, but the allowances were always far more than the Board of Trade scale. No pot ever went on the galley stove, the contents of which were not shared by all hands. If the 'tween decks growled about the stockfish and the dog's body, they had at least the consolation of knowing that we had the same fare. In this respect I was strictly democratic always, but there were growls enough. To complain about the food, anywhere, seems a general human disposition. But no one in the ship lost any weight. Many of the boys, in the 2 years they were on board, gained a foot in height and 20 pounds in weight. For the actual rounding of the Horn from 50 south in the Pacific to 50 south in the Atlantic, I had a demijohn of rum doled out nightly in boiling hot tea with supper. We were 2 weeks out before the first storm blew, and then it was a mild one, hard from the northward, first with rain and the glass falling. About 12 hours of this, and then with a slight lift of the glass, the jump to south-southwest. One has to watch these jumps closely so that they do not catch the ship by the lee. But in the South Pacific it is usually possible to see when they are coming. If only with a few minutes' warning, this is enough. There is a hesitant lull, or a heavier rain, or an instant clearing of the southern sky, then stand from under, with a gust of violence that shakes the ship and scares at once all the tumult from the north winds. See, the south gale comes. One becomes used to them after a while. After the wind has jumped to the south, it usually blows the sky clear, and settles into a comfortable steady gale from somewhere about the southwest, fair wind, and most helpful to the vessel's progress. But with our first gale we had a high breaking sea, and violent squalls of hail, and the parole of the main topsail yard carried away. This the carpenter and his gang repaired easily, but she was an old ship, I knew, and she had been sailing hard. I hoped that nothing else would carry away. I had done the best I could. We were lucky on the whole, on the run towards the Horn, luckier than I had ever been before, on a winter's run. Luckier perhaps than we deserved. We had one determined heavy gale, a screaming madness of wind to which I dared show no rag of sail, a roaring tumult from the southwest which, even though it was fair wind, I could not use. This was as bad a gale as any one on board had ever experienced, worse than the storm that sent the sea breaking over the Parma's poop and broached her to in the grain race of 1932 on the way to Cape Horn, worse by far than anything we had in the Grace Harwar, the Herzogin, Cecile, the Lahill, or the Bolins. But we came through with no very great damage. True, the fore-topmast head was discovered sprung next morning, after we had been hove to 20 hours in the wild sea, with the oil bags out, and we had to send the fore-topgallant mast down, with some difficulty afterwards, properly securing the weakened topmast head beneath its wound. The starboard boat was stove in by the sea, and both light brackets were washed away. A door of the forward house was stove in. On the same wild night, the sea rushed in, and some of the rail aft was carried away. But these things, though serious, were relatively unimportant. We were still sound, though weakened. No one was hurt, and no one lost. We did not need to go in anywhere, and no water came below. We were 37 days in all, from Papeete Strand to beyond Cape Horn, and we sailed in that time something over 4,800 miles. Though it was no record, this was not bad after all. We had a small ship and an old one, and if the truth be told, a somewhat weakened vessel by that time, at least aloft. It was easterly wind that gave me most cause for alarm. On the run towards the Horn, winter is usually more settled than the summer months, though the short days, the long nights, and the intense cold add to the misery, but it also the season of easterly winds, when some 20 days out from Tahiti we had 3 days of easterly conditions and southeast wind. I was afraid we might have to beat there a long time, and we had to do in the Grace Horror. Once in June. But we were fortunate. After the easterlies we had 1 day of southerly gale with sleet squalls and savage cold, then hard south-southwest and southwest, increasing almost to a hurricane, and after that southerly conditions and good progress right up to the Cape Horn. I broached the demijohn of rum the day we came to 50 south, since we then needed it, but I found the stone jar half full and the rum watered. The miserable cads who had perpetrated that contemptible theft against a defenseless ship and a score odd frozen mariners were swine indeed. I had bought the thing in Melbourne, and it came on board sealed. It is this sealing of ship stores that makes such thieving possible. Give the ship anything, they cannot check it, and they won't be back. Who had stolen the rum and watered the remnants of it, I don't know, but it was no one on in the ship, for the demijohn had borne the customs seal unbroken since first it came on board. Australian rum usually is fiery stuff, but this pallid fluid tasted like ginger ale. The loss of the rum was serious, for it was the only comfort we had. Used judiciously, served out nightly into the tea, there would have been enough in a full demijohn to see us round the Horn. It was as a necessary medical comfort that we needed it, and not with the remotest idea of indulging any taste for alcohol we might have. We had no heat, all was wet where the great sea ran, and the sprays clouded the driving ship to the topgallant yards. The decks were open, and there was no shelter anywhere through the long night watches. Life was existence, a determined hanging on, with the ship lurching wildly and plunging, and the hail squalls screaming in the rigging, and some sure swine, seated comfortably before his fire, had guzzled our rum. It is not for coming on deck one needs the stuff, not for any careless tossing down to gain a momentary illusion. Then its effect is brief and quickly passing, leaves the cold body worse equipped for the night-long vigil. But when one is turning in for a short sleep, it courses through the blood, quickens the arteries, and livens the mind until one can forget frozen extremities and frostbitten hands, and sink quickly into a dreamless slumber that no rolling of the plunging ship can disturb, to turn out a few hours later really refreshed and better able to go on. The unutterable cads ashore could buy more rum, we could not. What was stolen could not be replaced. 3 weeks out from Tahiti we had made only some 2,100 miles. It was nearing the end of July when we had the great storm. It began to pipe up from the south-southwest on the Saturday when we had been at sea 23 days, and the glass fell for 3 days. From noon Saturday to noon Sunday we ran 208 miles in a high sea, which was fairly good going for so small a vessel. Throughout Sunday she ran on well in a high breaking sea, with the frequent long, hard squalls increasing, with the early coming of the cold night, to a strong gale before which we still ran under the close-reefed fore and main topsails and the storm fore topmast staysail. This day we sailed over the place where Ronald Walker, aged 21, had been buried from the poop of the ship Grace Harwar in 1929 after being killed at his work in the rigging. I flew the Australian ensign at half-mast in his memory. This day, too, we saw a strange and beautiful white bird, which was not an albatross. We had none of us seen a sea-bird of this kind before, and did not know what it was. The night brought sleet and snow and greater wind. About daylight next morning, just before 9, a brief lull tempted me to give her the reefed foresail, for this was fine fair wind, and in the great sea her speed had dropped a little, but the lull was illusory, and I could not keep the new sail set half an hour. It came in again without damage. All hands had long grown expert at the handling of recalcitrant square sail, even under the most dangerous conditions. Noon of that day, the third day of the blow, brought frequent violent snow squalls, blowing fiercely from the west-southwest, and the sea was now dangerously high. I took in the close-reefed main topsail, and goose-winged the fore, continuing to run under this minimum of canvas, with the fore-topmast staysail to help the steering. But by 6 bells in the afternoon the gale was such that I began to think seriously of the vulnerability of the decks, the skylights with open ship below, the weak big doors. If a skylight were stove in, it would be bad. We had done what we could to protect them, but they were still weaknesses. And the chart-house doors fitted ill. The steel chart-house, a welded job from Ipswich, had not been very well made, and the doors could not be strengthened. I had the boys to think of. I had to get round the Horn. I could take no undue chances. I could not stand having to take a badly damaged ship in anywhere for repairs. That would be the end of the voyage. I wished, on the other hand, to make all the progress I could while the wind was fair, because of the probability of easterlies afterwards, and because I wanted naturally enough to be gone from those cold latitudes as quickly as possible. But there came a time when it was dangerous to run on. The glass still dropped. It became obvious that, bad as it was, the gale itself had not yet begun, though the wind screaming in the rigging, the fierce rolling had caused the compass to swing violently, and steering was difficult even by day. The feeling of the wind on their faces was the helmsman's best guide, but by night this is poor substitute for a compass. Though she still ran well in the great seas, she was clearing their ever-rising crest with less and less margin. Sea after sea thundered at her, broke in a wild eruption of spray and spume and murderous noise, and thundered by. She was foam-covered to the trucks. The wet dome of the sky sat heavy on the mastheads, never lifting to give any light beyond a gray, wintry gloom. Now night was coming down. I put out oil and ran on, but this was dangerous. I thought again of the vulnerability of the decks, of all the lives entrusted to my care. Should I still run? But if I hove to, I should drift in the valley of the sea on my way. The headlong rush would cease. No more would the brave ship run down a degree of longitude every 4-hour watch, but I should still drift quietly on, and I could lie there in safety, putting out oil. The drift and the send of the sea would give me 2 knots, and if I broached to, if I ran too long, if I ran those gigantic breaking seas on board, there would be no morning. Surely the wind would not further increase, the sea not further rise. She had run in safety this long, why not go on? No time to waste. And yet the safety of all hands was in my keeping. If I made a mistake, I should have a lot to explain before God. Still she ran. I watched the sea rise, heard the wind increase, suffered the cutting hail. The sweetness of her underwater body was counting now, and she still avoided the weight of the seas with a great cunning in whose contrivance it seemed that man had no part, though she ran drier, with some at the helm, than for others. Her bluff black bows rode down the hollows and rose upon the crests, and her sweet clean counter dragged no quartering waves to upset the breaking seas and bring them upon us, though she ran at speed. Now the hail squalls close in, and night is coming down. Heave to or run on. Better lie to the night in the trough of the sea, bowing to the storm, than run on and never come to the morning. The squalls march, the wind shrieks, the sea thunders, the ship reels, staggers, lurches, flings herself onwards over those high green hills, each of which breaks in a flurry of foam as she passes, into the troughs so deep that the wind goes from the sails and screams the louder in the upper rigging. Good helmsmanship alone can guide her now. I have taken in the clew of the fore topsail, and she runs on under the staysail alone, a rag of wind-stiffened, sea-soaked canvas bellied at the bow. The boiling of the foam flying by reeks of murder. No, no, I shall not run on this night. It is fair wind, but I cannot go. If any of those great seas breaks on me, if for a moment one of the helmsmen so much as fumbles with a spoke, if the ghastly tumult of the maddening sea can come on board, these things in this fair wind are fatal, fatal, and I answer for 22 lives. The mizzen staysail is set, a small sail of stout canvas, to keep her head up when she comes to. I take the wheel and wait for what chance may come. It is the very last of the daylight. The yards which have been squared are braced full and by. There is now no sail on them. Off the deck now. The sailors crowd in under the forecastle head, the only sheltered place. I wait even with only these 2 rags of staysails. On her she runs 8 knots. If she comes up to the sea at that speed and runs into a wall of breaking water, God help us all. The oil bags are out, have been out a long time. They help, but nothing can stop a real breaking Cape Horn sea if a ship swings into it with speed. The safety of lying to lies in the fact that the ship then yields. She does not fight the headway. She lies in the trough of the sea with her shoulder to the breaking water, like an albatross asleep with its head beneath its wings, drifting and yielding. In great storms this is the only safe procedure, but I had now, with the ship still running at speed through the dangerously high sea, to bring her into the trough, to stop her way, without overwhelming her, to bring her up without giving the sea a chance to break on her while she still had way. It was a serious and dangerous proceeding, a chance now. I had waited long. The wind screamed in all the stays, and rose to a mad crescendo as the ship rolled to windward. Sea gushed from all the washports. The very spume lifted from the sea flew frightened in the air, but everything still held. A lull now, a vicious hail squall had just passed. There came a smooth in the wake of a giant sea that, passing under us, had flung us high and rolled the ship as if it had been shaking a swimming dog. This was the chance I awaited. Down helm. I forced the wheel down, and she came. The wake subsided, and the foam was not now streaking fast. At the same moment, while we still had way, I saw the great sea rise to windward, the great sea, the murdering one, a greater sea than any which had roared by that day. I had not been able to see it before. It had swept down savagely out of the murk and the chaos. I could not see far, nothing now but to fight it out. Break, then, you bastard sea. See if you can smash us. It seemed to me at the wheel that I could feel the ship stiffen for the meeting, summon up all the reserves of her great whole strength to take this shuddering blow. It would be bad, I knew, she knew. Implacable and murderous, the thundering sea rushed on, its pleasure glinting in light from the tumult of its driving foam. Up it towered, and the little ship rose valiantly to meet it. But she could not do it, she could not do it. I knew as soon as I saw that sea. No oil, no anything could stem that insane onrush. She rose, but not enough. I stood at the wheel, clinging with all my strength to the spokes, for I knew that breaking sea would come there too. The sea came, flinging the oil bags contemptuously back on board before it, snarling and roaring high above the weather rail. An instant it hung there, and I could see the glint of evil in the foam-streaked green water. Then it broke on board. It might very well have been the end of us, but the little ship somehow avoided the worst of its force. We had taken only a glancing blow. It filled the decks and stormed aft. It swept over me at the wheel. It drove over the saloon skylight, over everything. Would she lift again? Would another come while the weight of the first still held her down? She began very slowly to lift, to free herself through the washports of the sea's dangerous load. Her way was gone now. She shed the water in a long time, or so it seemed, and afterwards no more came. The skylights had held. There was no water down below. We were in the trough now, and so lay in safety that long wild night. In the morning we saw that the starboard boat was badly stove in, where the sea had lifted it on the chooks, and as if the stout manila lashings had been cotton, and had cast it aside. Both light brackets were gone. A door on the forward house, fortunately one of slight importance, which gave entrance to the lamp trimmer's small room, was smashed to splinters, and the sea ran in and out among the lamps. And worst of all, the fore-topmast head was badly sprung from inherent weakness, which the storm had brought out. The mast was so badly sprung that the topgallant yard and mast had to come down. I lay hove to for 20 hours. It was the worst weather of the whole voyage. The tumult of the implacable sea through that wild night was frightening. Even hove to, she lay rolling heavily, but she rode the seas and shipped no more water. It was noon the next day. The Tuesday before, I dared put up the helm, though the wind all this time had been fair. The conditions had eased a little then, and I ran on under the close-reefed main topsail and fore-topmast staysail, and still put out oil. In this wild weather the fore-topgallant mast was taken down, and preventer stays of iron wire were spliced and set up to the topmast head underneath the place where it was sprung. A new fore-topmast stay had also to be set up, of iron wire double. This was a difficult rigging job to do in those conditions, but all hands worked through until it was done. By that time the weather had moderated considerably, and I was able to set good running sail. The loss of the fore-topgallant mast and the weakening of the headstays was a serious blow, upsetting as it did the sailing balance of the ship, particularly for windward working. I had to be more careful now than ever, but we sailed from the scene of the accident, some 2,000 miles westward of Cape Horn, to the end of the voyage without that mast. I hoped now we should have no more such gales, though that was by no means certain. The little ship made no water and continued to run on, buoyant and brave in the great seas. The skylight coverings had unquestionably brought her through that night of storm. Even after that, only 2 of the bunks were sodden, so she ran on from there to the Horn. There was not another great gale, though there were minor storms, trifling things, with the wind only pretending. It often happens in those latitudes in winter that after a severe storm the weather is settled, more or less, for a greater or less period, depending upon the ferocity of the storm. The worse the storm, the longer the period of settled conditions afterwards. This is no law, but I had noticed it on other voyages, so it proved now. We did not have another really hard blow. We had instead a succession of southerly conditions, gloomy at times with fog, and the clammy moisture weeping from the sails and all the gear, sometimes clear for a time, but never bright, and for the most part heavily overcast, with the wind always somewhere between south by east and west by north, not often from the westward. We made good progress. There was not again occasion to consider heaving to. In 1 week we ran 1,348 miles from Wednesday, July 29th to Tuesday, August 4th. This was an average speed of 8 knots for the 7 days. Not bad for a ship only 100 feet on the water line, partially dismasted, pretty old, and long in tropic waters, with her iron hull gathering long grass. For such a ship to storm at 8 knots for a week in the great west winds through high seas the whole time was, I thought, a credit to her designers and her builders. She was not built for speed, though she was built to sail well. The primary consideration was safety. To sail at 8 knots for a week in quiet water would not be anything to cheer, but a high breaking sea is a serious handicap. In 11 days we ran 2,000 miles. I was careful all this time. I did not try to drive, but to do my best with the ship as she was, as the conditions as I found them. Throughout these 11 days we showed no kites, though I was accustomed to hold to the main topgallant sail, which usually did not get becalmed in the troughs. We ran in the ice line day and night with double lookouts and the foghorn going from far south of 55 southernmost ship in the world. Then last full rigor to make a Cape Horn rounding, staggering onwards with no lights lit, the rust streaks growing on all the paint, the 4 topgallant masts below, and only one good boat. That would be useless here if there were real need of it. Nothing now comes to those waters. We were south of the meat ship's track from New Zealand to England. No outward bounders now thrash round the Chilean ports for nitrate, and I was glad no ship might loom before our path. No ship, and nothing now but icebergs. We ran on unlit through the long nights, for the light brackets were both gone and the lamp room destroyed. Had we shown a sidelight, we should have lost it. So we came to the 8th of August, and on that day were off Cape Horn, and by the evening round and into the Atlantic, good ocean. All the reefs and all the storms of the great Pacific were behind. How long the tumult of those waters had saved the South Seas from destruction! It seemed almost as if the great belt of the roaring winds had been sent down there by nature to make the westward rounding of the Horn difficult, and keep the marauding whites from the Pacific Isles. For hundreds of years they had succeeded. We saw nothing of Cape Horn. The day was gloomy and all overcast, with strong wind, and I had no observations. I had meant, if I could, to have a look at Diego Ramirez to check the rating of the chronometer, but I could not risk it. We saw nothing but one piece of kelp, a large piece drifting by, and the obvious ground swell of graying soundings by the Ramirez bank, a swell that stayed all day and was then gone as suddenly as it came, with both its coming and its goings as noticeable as name boards on a street. We must have passed pretty close to get on the bank. We ran too fast to take soundings, and I would not stop. We were probably within 5 miles of Diego Ramirez. We could only see 1 mile most of the day. So we came round, and the next day, being clear, saw Staten Island, and all the wild snow-covered hills of Tierra del Fuego, and the tide-swept break of the Straits of Le Maire. The boys were splendid. True, they had heard so much of Cape Horn's bitterness, that now we were round, they were almost disappointed. What, only one hurricane, only one lost mast, one stove boat, and Jan, the son of Captain Junker, recalled the mean misery of winter Baltic voyages, and topsail schooners and barkentines, lashed round with chain that they might not burst with their timber, cargoes swelled with the sea, which beat and beat in winter gales until they were covered with ice, and there was no food on board, no food, no warmth, no dry spot, and nothing accomplished. When the hard voyage at last was done, except that a stack of timber had been delivered, and the carpenter, the wild man from Ramau, discoursed on the perils of North Sea winters, and the wretchedness of great schooners and wooden barks bound west round the north of Scotland. But they all of them, the grain ship sailors, the Baltic mariners, the boys, thanked God that our way, which could have been so hard, had been lightened for us, and the little ship had passed so gently. They were good boys. What had I as a crew? A small group of grain ship sailors aged from 19 to 21, veterans of perhaps 2 previous Cape Horn roundings, and a handful of British schoolboys from England and the Dominions. Aye, they were pretty good. There was no hanging back, no moaning, there was no need to shout about the decks, and blasphemy. All the malcontents were long departed. For Cape Horn, no moaning, no moaners, and I thought, as I looked round me at the youthful crew, that there were guts and red blood still in youth, still in England. I looked back now at Staten Island with the Horn behind, and I hoped to God I should come that way no more in sail. I had hoped that before, perhaps even more fervently, on at least 2 occasions. Yet here I was again, and I made no promises and took no oaths, for I knew well that my life, such as it is too bound up in these ships for me to make forecasts. If the ships bring me here again, I suppose I shall come, but I hope not. It is not the sense in these days too often to sail that grim road.